I'm going to begin us here with the part of the course that veers into apologetics, properly described at any rate. And we're going to look at mere Christianity. We're going to take 4 classes to do the 4 books. So for some of you, that's maybe the part of the course you've been looking forward to. I don't know. For some of you, it's the more philosophical component that will leave you a little bit cold. But at any rate, it's an important part of Lewis's corpus of writing. And context is important here. They're first delivered as radio talks between 1942 and 1944. So right in the middle of the Blitz, the bombing of London by the Germans, which is the backdrop for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The kids are taken out of London. He writes that several years later, but still it's fresh in his mind. So these talks are given between 1942 and 1944. The lectures that he delivered at the University of Durham, the Abolition of Man, which we began the course with, those are delivered in 1943. So right in the midst of the same period. And he's in demand as a public speaker. And when we looked at the Abolition of Man, we saw that he was very interested in the problem in education that has arisen because they have denied the objectivity, the legitimacy of the approach to the humanities that he calls at its center the Tao, or in other words, that human beings have a moral nature. Moral concerns, aesthetic concerns related to goodness or beauty have been considered to be subjective. And because of that, they are being debunked in schools by the conditioners. And as a consequence, he says, there's a sort of turning on human nature by the scientific elite, which is not delivering power over nature, but rather delivering the power over other men's nature to a small group. And he wouldn't know it at the time, at least I don't think so, but this is exactly what was going on in Nazi Germany, and is part of the eugenics movement, which is not a German movement. It is a pan-Western movement, including here in Canada, but also in the US and certainly in the UK. The eugenics movement is the seedbed for the practice of abortion, Planned Parenthood, and so forth. It is in trying to perfect human nature, interestingly, that we find that people that are less than perfect or considered to be worthless or considered to be genetically inferior are being got rid of. And once that happens, the criteria of those who are fit to survive shrinks ever smaller. And who decides who those who deserve to survive will be, that is the scientific establishment in the end. So seriously, prophetic work, the Abolition of Man. This is, as I say, called mere Christianity. It's something apparently different, but what it has in common, I think, is its defense of morality. It's consistent throughout the 4 books. One of the things I puzzled about over the years is why Lewis wrote this book as he did, as the defense of Christianity, because really it's a defense based on the moral nature of mankind, of the moral nature of God, etc. So in chapter 1, we get morality as the clue to the meaning of the universe. That's what we're going to look at today. Book 1 is about morality as a sort of a clue. A clue, by the way, is not just in a whodunit mystery. It's a ball of string. It's called a clue. It's a way of unraveling it all. It's a clue to unravel the meaning of the universe. And Lewis points out that human morality points to a spiritual dimension to life that is best explained by a Christian understanding of human nature. That's book 2. We'll get to that next time. And then in the third book, he talks about the most helpful guidelines for that moral nature. It shares it in common to some degree with other religions, but the most helpful one, he suggests, is Christianity, and the most rational one. Before finally, he talks about how our moral hunger is not satisfied in ourselves, but rather is satisfied in a human being who's capable of that moral worthiness that we desire but don't have, and that's met in Jesus then. But note that the key note throughout the Abolition of Man and Mere Christianity is moral nature. So goodness. And he says this is why it's so concerning to him that education has abandoned making people love what they ought to love and hate what they ought to hate, which Aristotle says is the educator's aim. And all Christians, until recently, agree. So moral example, cultivating it, a certain walk in life. No longer in the public school system, he says. And I think what he said then is doubly true now. But what struck me about this is he moves away from what later becomes a trajectory of his, and we saw that in our discussion of Narnia and of the Great Divorce, and even Till We Have Faces. He's moved away. He's not talking about love. There he's talking about love. In his fictional writing, he pushes it more in the direction of the argument from desire. And there's a bit of that here with morality. As I say, the moral desires that we have to be good ourselves are not met in ourselves. They're only satisfied in the perfect man, Jesus. But that, again, is more in relation to goodness and not so much as in agape love. And that was so I wanted to just note that here. And this is the thing that puzzled me about Mere Christianity for years, is how it so strongly emphasized morality. And it moved away from doctrines that would be distinctively Christian, like the atonement. And interestingly, Lewis notes in the introduction to Mere Christianity that he had distributed copies of this amongst various clergymen, an Anglican, a Catholic, a Methodist, and a Presbyterian, I believe. And the only objection basically came from the Catholic, and he said, you haven't got into the atonement, the different theories of the atonement too much, sufficiently. So this is an objection. It's interesting that the Presbyterian didn't object to that, because the Presbyterian would have said the same thing. And so the Protestants should have said, no, this is the point here. You've missed the atonement and the importance of the theories of the atonement in being Christian. Do you have faith in the atoning sacrifice of Christ? That's the Reformation is connected to that faith in the grace of God demonstrated there, and Catholics have a different view. And the Roman Catholic priest to whom he sent this, that was his objection. I have the same objection. I'm going to tell you, this is and I was very puzzled by this when I first read this. But he purports to be writing something on which all Christians will agree. And he acknowledges also that the things on which they don't agree are not irrelevant or even insignificant. They may be central, and in fact, he thinks that they are. But he's not going to talk about those things. So this is the problem when you give Mere Christianity to a friend who's not a Christian and say, this is what Christians believe. It doesn't touch on the thing that actually is the central issue of the Christian faith, and which divides Christians. So this is a problem. But it's very interesting and very helpful in other ways, and very thoughtful, and it introduces us to common ground. And again, I said the backdrop here is important. When Lewis was university age. He went to war, First World War along with Tolkien, and spent years in the trenches. Ended up getting wounded and coming back and so forth. And that colors his whole life. You can hear him talk about the experience of being in war. And Tolkien likewise in his works. They know what it was like, the horrors of modern warfare, being stuck in a ditch with disease and with a sense of futility about the whole endeavor as well. And the First World War really is over a patch of mud. And it goes on, a war of attrition for 4 years, and then they quit for a while, and then they go back at it 20 years later. In 1940, when Britain started to be bombed, he became an air raid warden in Oxford. Had the helmet on. They had razor wire around the walls of the Oxford colleges. And he would give talks to the men in the RAF, the Royal Air Force, because again, he was a Christian, he was a gifted speaker, he was a veteran, and so he was asked to give talks to these men. They went on 13 bombing missions. They're most of them gone at the end of that. They're all dead, the men he spoke to. You can imagine being an undergraduate, your whole class is pretty much dead, and then you give talks to young men about to serve in the war, defending their country, and they're all gone. And you are going to then speak in public about Christianity, mere Christianity, and you're going to be then speaking on the problems of suffering and pain and evil and so forth. So there's a legitimacy about this. It hits him, and he has authenticity, and he speaks with his own voice, and I think that's what is mostly persuasive about it. So it's not even though he's an academic, he doesn't approach it really academically, and it's clearly an intellectual enterprise, and he makes typically brilliant Lewis observations, but the illustrations are very accessible. You can imagine immediately anyone reading this or hearing it and thinking that Lewis is just sitting, it's like I'm sitting in a pub alongside of him and we're just having a talk. And so it has that wonderful oral quality to it. And it's only adapted a little bit for the written book we call Mere Christianity. So he's saying it it's very simple, but it is the most important thing. And again, the bombs are falling as he's delivering the talks. About the title, this phrase, mere Christianity, he picks up from a Puritan by the name of Richard Baxter. It's his phrase, and he used it again in other contexts. So in a little work by Athanasius, the great Christian church father, on the Incarnation, he gives a justification for reading old books. I don't know if you've read the book. I've read it, and I read the introduction, and I was struck by the phrase. So he says that the division of Christendom, divisions are undeniable and are by some of these writers most fiercely expressed, those who saw themselves in different camps. But if any man is tempted to think, as one might be, who reads only contemporaries, that Christianity, in quotation marks, is a word of so many meanings that it means nothing at all, he can learn beyond all doubt by stepping out of his own century that this is not so. And this is the benefit of looking at Christianity from the vantage point of history as well. You can see, when you look at the divisions amongst Christians, the Catholics, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Anglicans, they will fiercely defend the divisions between them and say that, no, this is a bright red line, that they're not Christians, we are, because of this issue. He notes that with the benefit of historical hindsight, that what they see as an insuperable obstacle sort of disappears. There's far more common ground than you think. And he goes on to say, measured against the ages, mere Christianity, and this is his quotation, mere Christianity, so it's this phrase, turns out to be no insipid interdenominational transparency, but something positive, self-consistent, and inexhaustible. I know it, indeed to my cost. In the days when I still hated Christianity, I learned to recognize, like some all too familiar smell, that almost unvarying something which met me, now in Puritan Bunyan, now in Anglican Hooker, now in Thomist Dante. There's something that's common there. So for all the divisions they see between them, the Christians represent something unified that I hate, and there's no division for me. I see it there. So there's a similarity that he wants to identify there, and that's what he's trying to present. Now this is interesting. It's in wartime. What do you do during war? You unify. The camp needs to be united. You need to hold a united front. And furthermore, you need to recognize that actually, for all the importance of the differences, and he doesn't discount that, there is a common enemy. And the enemy is to Christ, and you stand on the side of Christ. Now, he's not watering it down and saying that the differences don't matter, but he is saying, let's talk about what is common and mere Christianity. And by mere, he doesn't mean the lowest common denominator. That he makes that clear. So it's not mere in the sense of something that we can set aside, but rather something which is essential. We don't usually use the word mere that way, but Lewis is using it that way. We all agree on these things that I'm writing about, and we all think that they are essential things. So in Acts 11, I believe, it speaks about where Christians of Antioch were first called Christians. And then in the council in Jerusalem in Acts 15, it talks about the doctrine of the disciples and certain forms of moral living as to hold on to those things. That's what Lewis is defining here. And he writes, I have always in my books been concerned simply to put forward mere Christianity, wrote Lewis to a correspondent, and he wants to present that in his fiction as well. So there's no divisions there. And he sees as much in common between the Anglo-Catholics in his church and the evangelicals. They have a supernatural faith. They believe in the miracles. They believe that God is transcendent. They believe that God is God. They have a commonality which they deny themselves. They say, well, those are the Anglo-Catholics. They're into the bells and smells. We're the evangelicals. We're into happy, clappy choruses, and we deny those things, and we reject it as sort of papist practices. You ever heard bells and smells? No. It's a very English way of describing the Anglo-Catholics. But he says there's more in common there than amongst the liberal theologians and the modernists. They stand against that commonality. So there is a mere Christianity that is to be found amongst Catholics, amongst evangelicals, of whatever stripes, and of high church Anglicans, of which Lewis probably is. Lewis is not an evangelical, sorry to say. In fact, his take on the atonement, or rather that he leaves it out, doesn't get into it, is one of the reasons that the Christian unions, the evangelical Christian unions in the UK, don't invite him as a speaker, because he's not talking about for them, the most important thing. And again, as I read him for the first time as a young Christian, I read him as an adult in my 30s. As an already converted, I understand the Christian faith. I read him and I said, but he's not talking about the atonement. He's not talking about justification by faith. He's not talking about the soul as the Reformation at all. What is this? So it struck me, and I understood why there were objections, and I know people who say he's not a Christian at all. All over the place in the Christian community. Outside the Christian community, he's identified as being the quintessential defender of the Christian faith. And as I say, B.F. Skinner calls him the best representatives of the, and the last and best of the representatives of the life of freedom and dignity. Isn't that interesting? And Skinner is one of the conditioners that Lewis would be talking about if Skinner had lived 20 years earlier, writing in 1970. So this is what is so interesting to me. It's remained compelling. People, I think, whenever you are asked, or when I was a pastor, I was asked what book should they give to people who are, exploring Christianity. Mere Christianity would be one that I would point them to. But I did say what I just said, but it doesn't talk about the most important thing. So I don't know what to say on that front. One thing also, just by way of preface, Lewis in The Abolition of Man is very concerned, because this is a topic now. In The Abolition of Man, he's not only concerned with Christianity, he's concerned with human nature. And there is another movement that's concerned with human nature at the same time, which I wanted to talk about briefly because it's important as a backdrop. And that's those who will adhere to the idea of a perennial philosophy, a perennial human nature. And this is not the same thing. At this time, there's Aldous Huxley writes, I think it's Aldous Huxley. Yes, it's Aldous Huxley, writes a book called The Perennial Philosophy, in which he effectively sees or claims that all religions fundamentally, despite their apparent differences, point to one truth, the same truth. It's the elephant thing, right? One sees the blind man and the elephant. One grabs the leg of the elephant and says that God is like, he's upright and firm and whatever. Another grabs the tusk and no, he's hard and smooth. Another grabs the trunk and sees, no, it's pliable and so on. All of them have this, but it's the same elephant, right? But they all grasp the same truth. They grasp it just from a different angle, but it's the same truth. That's the perennial philosophy. And it exists at this very same time as this is happening. It's being presented in the humanism of the UN and in the Unitarian religious movement of the 19th and 20th century. Aldous Huxley holds to it. It's in the Neoplatonism of the 15th century, Hermetic philosophy, sort of, and it is to some degree the theology of the unknown God, Deus incognito. I talked about that, right? And in the 19th century, again, Romantic writers and Enlightenment thinkers perceive God as unknowable. Whereas, as I suggested, Lewis presents that God, although he's mysterious, isn't unknowable, but he's hidden. And there's a vast gulf of difference there between being hidden and revealing and simply being unknowable. If it's unknowable, then you pursue the path of the perennial philosophy of Aldous Huxley. And that ends up in a sort of mysticism and a sort of interest in the occult. You get it in the Kabbalah and so forth. To this day, you get it in seances. And so there's a harmony of all human thought. That's not what Lewis is presenting here. It's not mere humanity, it's mere Christianity. And the reason it's not mere humanity is because the humanity doesn't become truly human until it becomes Christian. But you can't come at mere Christianity through mere humanity, even though he begins with a discussion about morality as a clue to the meaning of the universe. You can't come at it from that direction, per se, by just looking at the commonalities between all religions and moral nature. As I say, it sounds very similar, but it's doing something very different. Does that make any sense? So he's not going the route of universalism. And I say that because by including something that all Christians will agree with, it may suggest he is going in the direction of the World Council of Churches, and with the flattening of doctrine, and with basically a variety of humanism. Well, that moves in the direction of Aldous Huxley's perennial philosophy. And that is something he's writing against. And I wanted to alert you to a book written by a very fine scholar, Alan Jacobs, talking about the same project amongst various writers. And this is 1943. The book's called The Year of Our Lord, 1943. Christian Humanism in an Age of Crisis. The 5 writers are Jacques Maritain, T.S. Eliot, C.S. Lewis, W.H. Auden, and Simone Weil. Their allegiance to Christianity in some cases is a little suspect. Simone Weil, not so sure. A little odd, but still. And they are writing about the same crisis they perceive, and they are responding to as Christian humanists. And the downbeat is on the adjective. They are humanists, but they're Christian humanists. And there's something distinctive about the Christian humanism as opposed to Aldous Huxley's atheistic humanism. Comments or questions as far before that? I will go on to look at Book 1 of the Abolition of Man. No? No? Okay. So he is interested in not a perennial philosophy, but a perennial human nature. And so it comes at it through the notion of personhood. And this, again, is connected to the Deus absconditus. The hidden God reveals himself in the God-man Jesus Christ. And so we know who God is by virtue of his Son, the person we call Jesus. So we can't come at philosophy through abstraction. We have to come at it through a person. And that's why Lewis begins with the discussion of persons and their perceptions of justice. How does he begin this? Book 1, right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. It's a clue. How does he begin? With Lewis's typical classical approach to writing essays, with a sort of a hook to pull us in. And it's a little story that everyone in his audience will identify with as a way of getting them into seeing that, one, the speaker knows what they're like, and also he's one of them. I'm on your side. I'm going to talk about things that, even though I'm talking about Christianity, and you may not be Christians, I'm not so different from you that I don't know what it's like to be in your position. And vice versa, as a consequence, you can follow what I'm saying. And so how does he begin? Everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny, and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant. But however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kind of things they say. They say things like this: how'd you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave him alone. He isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on. You promised. People say things like that every day. Educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups. Now, he mentions this because he knows he's an Oxford professor, and everyone is immediately not only thinking I'm listening to somebody on the BBC, so he's part of the cultural elite, but he's an Oxford professor at that, and he's probably he's got airs about himself. He's looking down his nose. He immediately addresses the implicit objection to him speaking to them. So I'm going to listen to this man. Now, what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He is appealing to some standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. And the other man very seldom replies, "To hell with your standard." Nearly always he tries to make out that what he has been doing does not really go against the standard, or that if it does, there is some special excuse. So it doesn't deny that there is a standard, just says it doesn't apply for whatever reason. He pretends that there's some special reason in this particular case why the person who took the seat first should not keep it, or that things were quite different when he was given the bit of orange, or that something has turned up which lets him off keeping his promise. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule or fair play or decent behavior or morality or whatever you like to call it. Note that he moves from one of those things to the next and suggests that they're synonymous, because some people will want to put it in legalistic terms. Those will probably be more of the, in the legal profession, but also perhaps in the, amongst the philosophers. They're going to want to talk about a law. A rule, again, same sort of thing. Very abstract, to some degree bureaucratic. When you get to fair play, now we're talking about games, kids, schoolyards, decent behavior, or morality, or whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed, and they have. If they had not, they might, of course, fight like animals, but they would not quarrel in the human sense of the word. Quarreling means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong, and that's what they're doing. That's not fair. You're trying to show that that's wrong. Why are you doing that? Why are you bothering? Somebody takes your seat, somebody doesn't reciprocate a kindness. Why do you bring that to their attention? Why don't you just punch them in the nose? Why don't you just take the orange back? Sometimes the kids do, of course. But often they'll point out that they haven't done what they ought to do. Immediately they gravitate towards that. That's his interest, that it's something about human nature that they do exactly that. And he says, now this law or rule about right and wrong used to be called the law of nature. Nowadays, when we talk of the laws of nature, we usually mean things like gravitation or heredity or the laws of chemistry. This is an argument he made in The Discarded Image, by the way. Remember when he was talking about the law of gravity? We actually misapply this observation about the natural world. We speak of it in humanistic terms, as if it could do anything other than obey, like as if obedience were the issue. Aristotle talks about it in terms of loves, like the stone loves to fall to the ground. It is attracted to it. That's a strange way of it's a strange way of observing it, but and it's a sort of an analogy based on the way we look at things. That's the way other things behave. So it's the microcosm to the macrocosm, right? We're a little world. Here's a big world. The big world behaves just like the little world, namely us. We're moved by our loves, or we're moved by our sense of moral order. And here he's talking about moral order. But when the older thinkers called the law of right and wrong the law of nature, they really meant the law of human nature. The very topic that he discussed in The Abolition of Man, and says that they are denying. The idea was that just as all bodies are governed by the law of gravitation and organisms by biological laws, so the creature called man also had his law, with this great difference, that a body could not choose whether it obeyed the law of gravitation or not. But a man could choose either to obey the law of human nature or to disobey it. Now that is not a small distinction. So there's a law, but we can break the law, but the law of gravity can't be broken. For which reason, calling it a law almost seems like a misnomer, because that's what all human laws are there to prevent you from doing something they don't want you to do, but you can do it, which is why punishments come along with the breaches in the law. So there it's, in a sense, the law of human nature is the only rightly applied use of the word law, whereas gravity is not a law at all, because it's never violated. You never can drop a stone and find it goes upwards rather than downwards. It doesn't happen. Where gravity happens. In outer space, it might. We may put this in another way. Every man is at every moment subjected to several different sets of law, but there's only one of these which he is free to disobey. As a body, he is subjected to gravitation and cannot disobey it. If you leave him unsupported in midair, he has no more choice about falling than a stone has. As an organism, he's subjected to various biological laws which he cannot disobey any more than an animal can. That is, he cannot disobey those laws which he shares with other things. But the law which is peculiar to his human nature, the law he does not share with animals or vegetables or inorganic things, is the one he can disobey if he chooses. Now, the one unique thing, and what is that connected to? It's not his vegetable nature, the fact that he grows, the fact that he needs nutrition. Remember when in the discard image he talked about us having a vegetable nature? In that sense, we share that in common with the vegetables. With the animals, we have the ability to move. We have physical bodies. There's limitations on those bodies. We procreate and so forth. These are commonalities with animals. What's distinct about human nature is the capacity for reasoning. And capacity for reasoning also includes the capacity for choosing. And in that area, we can disobey. So it is connected with reasoning. Now, he's making a rational argument, but it's a very helpful one. This law was called the law of nature because people thought that everyone knew it by nature and did not need to be taught it. They did not mean, of course, that you might not find an odd individual here and there who did not know it, just as you find a few people who are colorblind or have no ear for a tune. But taking the race as a whole, they thought that the human idea of decent behavior was obvious to everyone. And I believe they were right. If they were not, then all the things we said about the war were nonsense. What's the sense in saying the enemy were in the wrong unless right is a real thing? And the Nazis at bottom knew as well as we did and ought to have practiced. Right? There's no point in saying the enemies are bad guys. Contemporary illustration, that the Russians were wrong to have invaded Ukraine unless we have a sense of right and wrong. And it's a very strong sense of that. Otherwise, the language is meaningless. And also the desire to fight this, and at the cost of huge blood and treasure, falls on deaf ears. People say, why are we going to waste our money? Why are we going to send people to die if there isn't some high cause here or some sense of wrong? But there is that sense, he says, and likewise during the Second World War, he's speaking to the RAF, these young men, some of whom he's taught, and they're all going to die. Or they all did die. If they had no notion of what we mean by right, then though we might have still had to fight them, we would have no more blamed them for that than for the color of their hair. This is why people get angry with one another. Again, you don't get angry at a dog for not obeying you. You might be frustrated. You might say bad dog, but you don't actually think the dog's a bad dog. And if somebody sticks their hand in a dog's food dish and the dog bites them, you can say bad dogs, you bit the kid who stuck his hand in the food dish, but actually you don't think the dog's a bad dog. You think the kid was stupid for putting his hand in the food dish. Or didn't know any better, because they don't know animals. The kid doesn't understand that animals whom they love are animals and not people. And the animal thought that you were taking his food and therefore bit you. Right? And you say bad dog because you want to say to the kid, that wasn't right, and I want to show you that this was a wrong thing for the bit, but actually the dog's not responsible in that sense. So we were anthropomorphizing by talking about the dog in that sense, because this is an animal and not a person, and animals don't have the capacity for reason. They didn't choose to do a bad thing. Now you can train that out of them, I think, but it's very difficult. And some dogs you certainly can. Watch out. So I know that some people say that the idea of a law of nature or decent behavior known to all men is unsound because different civilizations and different ages have had quite different moralities. But this is not true, says Lewis. There have been differences between their moralities, but these have never amounted to anything like a total difference. If anyone will take the trouble to compare the moral teaching of, say, the ancient Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Hindus, the Chinese, the Greeks, and Romans, what will really strike him will be how very like they are to each other and to our own. Now, he does this, and when he writes this up, he refers to the appendix of the Abolition of Man. This was put in after the fact. Remember, this is published in 1952. It was delivered in 1941. The Abolition of Man was delivered in 1943 and published in 1945. So the Abolition of Man already exists in the public's hands. Mere Christianity does not. So we can refer to the text of lectures that he delivered after this as if they were before it. So he's changed a little bit. For our present purpose, I need only ask the reader to think what a totally different morality would mean. In Canada, I hear this all the time in terms of cultural relativism, right? We can't expect one standard to rule everyone. You can live in accordance with your truth. But he says, let's do this thought experiment a little further. Think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who'd been kindest to him. You might just as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5, which is what our school system is teaching right now, because 2 + 2 = 4 is white math. But the evident absurdity of that position is evident to everyone. Men have differed as regards what people you ought to be unselfish to, whether it was only your own family or your fellow countrymen or everyone. But they have always agreed that you ought not to put yourself first. Everyone, in every race, in every culture, at all times. Where do we see this breached? Well, we see it in Odysseus, in Polyphemus the Cyclops. They live solitary lives. They don't make anything. They live off the land. They are the perfect environmentalists. They don't build anything. They don't pollute anything. They just live out of nature. Nature comes to them. They don't cultivate anything. So there's one illustration. Yes, that was a shot at the dark green movement, and it deserves shots. Many shots, but never mind. But selfishness has never been admired. Men have differed as to whether you should have 1 wife or 4, but they've always agreed that you must not simply have any woman you liked. So they thought that marriage there's a good there. You can't just be indiscriminate. But the most remarkable thing is this: whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in a real right and wrong, you will find the same man going back on this a moment later. He may break his promise to you, but if you try breaking one to him, he will be complaining it's not fair. That's true. And children will do this as well. So his whole point here in the first chapter is to illustrate that 2 things, at least 2 things. One, that human beings are different than the rest of the created order. And that's already pushing back against the flattening reductionism of his contemporaries. We don't only have a material nature, like the vegetables and like the animals. We also have this capacity for which we call freedom, and this thing that we call reasoning. And both of those direct us to certain virtues, certain laws, which we expect every other person who bears our similar image to follow. We all act that way. Doesn't matter what they look like in appearance, black, white, whatever. Female, male, young, old, whatever. We recognize the differences between age and certain differences, but those are accommodations to the specificity of the circumstance. So a small child doesn't know the consequences of his or her actions. And so you treat the child differently. Right? We have the idea of an age of consent, or the age of maturity, difference between a child and an adult, right? And so you treat children with greater leniency. So that sort of difference. But it's not that you regard this as a different sort of person, but just an immature one. And so it's important to treat children not as adults for that reason. That's another violation of human nature, actually. He doesn't even get into that, because basically it's inconceivable in his age. It's for our perverse post-Christian age to treat children as if adults. They were small adults with reasoning and the same freedom that we have, and that their consequences would be on them because it would be oppressive to treat them as anything other than adults. But he says that, let me go on to my next point, which is this: none of us are really keeping the law of nature. So that's the second point. So we are distinguished from the animals and the rest of the order of nature by this capacity to violate nature, the law of nature, the law of human nature. We have this capacity, and not only can we do that, we all do it. So this is a problem. So there's a distinctive thing between a human being, an animal, and a vegetable. The human beings recognize a moral law and can violate it. The second thing is that we do violate it. Very important point. Animals can't violate it, people can, and they do. Now he's rather funny, you can imagine him in a pub. If there are any exceptions among you, I apologize to them. They'd much better read some other book, for nothing I am going to say concerns them. And now, turning to the ordinary human beings who are left, in other words, everybody, I hope you will not misunderstand what I'm going to say. I am not preaching, and heaven knows I do not pretend to be better than anyone else. I'm only trying to call attention to a fact. The fact that this year, or this month, or more likely this very day, we have failed to practice ourselves the kind of behavior we expect from other people. There may be all sorts of excuses for this. The time you were so unfair to the children was when you were very tired. That slightly shady business about the money, the one you have almost forgotten, came when you were very hard up. And what you promised to do for old so-and-so and have never done, well, you never would have promised if you'd known how frightfully busy you were going to be. And as for your behavior to your wife, or husband, or sister, or brother, if I knew how irritating they could be, I would not wonder at it. And who the dickens am I anyway? I'm just the same. He says, I'm just the same. That is to say, I do not succeed in keeping the law of nature very well. And the moment anyone tells me I am not keeping it, there starts up in my mind a string of excuses as long as your arm. The question at the moment is not whether they are good excuses. The point is that they're one more proof of how deeply, whether we like it or not, we believe in the law of nature. This is a great proof of the law of nature. If we do not believe in decent behavior, why should we be so anxious to make excuses for not having behaved decently? We feel guilty. Feel like we have to come up with an excuse for it. Well, why would we do that if we didn't believe that we need to provide an excuse? Because there is such a thing as a law of human nature. If we do not believe in decent behavior, why should we be so anxious to make excuses? The truth is, we believe in decency so much, we feel the rule of law pressing on us so that we cannot bear to face the fact that we are breaking it. And consequently, we try to shift the responsibility. For you notice that it's only for our bad behavior that we find all these explanations. It's only for our bad temper that we put down to being tired or worried or hungry. We put our good temper down to ourselves. We don't need any excuses for that. That's, oh yeah, that's all me. Yes, I'll take that. But never the bad stuff. So these are the 2 points I want to make. First, human beings have this curious idea they ought to behave in a certain way, and they cannot get rid of it. And second, they do not, in fact, behave that way. They know the law of nature, they break it. These 2 facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. But as I say, there was another one in there, and it was implicit in there, and that is that human beings are different than the animal world, which the modern scientific establishment is denying in its reductionist approach to the humanities by treating people as animals that they can condition. But that's in a different, that's what he talks about in the Abolition of Man. He's not interested in going down that route here. He doesn't go down that rabbit trail. And it's not a rabbit trail, but an important digression. And I'm doing it simply because it fits the course material. There's a commonality here. He talks about that in another context. All clear thus far? Any comments thus far? Shall I say anything more? I mean, I read the whole chapter pretty much. Pretty much. I'm not sure I left anything out, in fact. I think it's important. The first chapter introduces, and once he's got you hooked there, that's one talk right there. You're coming back for the next one, I think. Because now he has your attention. He's pointed something unique about yourself, which you want to deny. Why do you want to deny it? Based on what he's just argued already. Why would you want to deny the law of human nature applies to you? Because it makes you feel guilty. Because it prevents you from choosing to do whatever you want to do. Because it says nothing flattering about you. All the things that flatter you, the things that you get credit for, you're willing to claim them anyway, but it reveals something about you that you don't want to talk about. That's why it suddenly, and this is why he says, I'm not preaching. But immediately we think he's preaching because he's talking about our sense of moral guilt. Right away. And it can't be denied. You can't deny it. So the first chapter is an absolute stormer of a chapter. It pushes it right into the realm of, just like he explains, and we'll get to this in the 4 loves, that love characterizes our motivations for things. We also recognize that there is a law that guides our whole way of thinking about the world. Okay, well then let me go on. So the next chapter, and there are 5, and I'm not going to get through all of them. In the second, he gets to some objections. I'm not sure if I want to get into the objections so much, but they're interesting objections. And the objections relate to the first point that I made about us distinguishing us from the animals. Because he says, but some people will say, isn't what you call the moral law simply our herd instinct? And hasn't it been developed just like all the other instincts? Right? So now he's going to go to that objection, and again, it comes from the Darwinian camp, the materialist camp, those that would reduce us just to being what he calls trousered apes. Is it not just an instinct? What you're calling a law, is that not the wrong word? Isn't it just an instinct? How does he respond? Well, now I do not deny that we may have a herd instinct, but that is not what I mean by the moral law. We all know what it feels like to be prompted by instinct, by mother love or sexual instinct. Note that he calls these things instincts now, the loves. Or the instinct for food. It means that you feel a strong want or desire to act in a certain way. And of course, we sometimes do feel just that sort of desire to help another person. And no doubt that desire is due to the herd instinct. But feeling a desire to help is quite different from feeling that you ought to help, whether you want to or not. So feeling that you want to help is different than feeling that you ought to help. The ought has a sense of moral conviction about it. Supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger, you'll probably feel two desires. One, a desire to give help. He's just saying, for the sake of our duty or herd instinct. The other, a desire to keep out of danger, due to the instinct for self-preservation. But you will find inside you, in addition to these two impulses, because those are both instincts. I want to preserve my life. I want to preserve that person's life. There's a third thing which tells you you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now, this thing that judges between two instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot be either of them. You might as well say the sheet of music which tells you at a given moment to play one note on the piano and not another is itself one of the notes on the keyboard. The moral law tells us the tune we have to play. Our instincts are merely the keys. Great illustration. And this is what makes this Mere Christianity so good. It's the illustrations. Another way of seeing this, that it's not merely instincts, is this. If two instincts are in conflict and there's nothing in a creature's mind except those two instincts, obviously, the stronger of the two must win. If there's nothing but two instincts, the stronger of the two instincts wins, of course. But at those moments when we are most conscious of the moral law, it usually seems to be telling us to side with the weaker of the two impulses. And what's the weaker of the two impulses? I want to help that guy. Or I ought to help that guy. I ought to save my life, I ought to help that guy. Who's that guy? Who is he? I don't know him. I look at him and I think, oh, I do know that guy. I don't like that guy. That's the guy who stole my lunch. He's drowning in the ditch. I ought to help him. Yeah. You probably want to be safe much more than you want to help the man who's drowning, especially if you don't like the man who's drowning. But the moral law tells you to help him all the same. And surely it often tells us to try to make the right impulse stronger than it naturally is. I mean, we often feel it our duty to stimulate the herd instinct by waking up our imagination and arousing our pity and so on, so as to get up enough steam for doing the right thing. But clearly we are not acting from instinct when we set about making an instinct stronger than it is. Instincts don't need to be strengthened, or they're not instincts. And again, this is what he's going to talk about in education, which in the Abolition of Man, this is precisely what we are there to do, is to train us to love what we ought to love and to hate what we ought to hate. We ought to hate our moral cowardice. We ought to love bravery. We ought to love self-sacrifice and putting others first. We ought to hate selfishness. That's what education's about. So there's the strengthening. But we're not appealing to the instincts to do that. We're appealing to something outside the instincts, which he calls the Tao. The thing that says to you your herd instinct is asleep, wake it up, cannot be the herd instinct. The thing that tells you which note on the piano needs to be played louder cannot be that note. And there's a third way of seeing it. If the moral law is one of our instincts, we ought to be able to point to some one impulse inside of us which was always what we call good, always in agreement with the rule of right behavior. But you cannot. There is none of our impulses which the moral law may not sometimes tell us to suppress, and none which it may not sometimes tell us to encourage. It's a mistake to think that some of our impulses, let's say mother love or patriotism, are good, and others, like sex or the fighting instinct, are bad. All we mean is that the occasions on which the fighting instinct or the sexual desire need to be restrained are rather more frequent than those for restraining mother love or patriotism. That's all we mean. But there are situations in which it is the duty of a married man to encourage his sexual impulse, and of a soldier to encourage the fighting instinct. When is the duty of the man to encourage his sexual impulse? When he wants to have children. His wife wants children. He's to have children. He's to encourage his sexual impulse. No. The fighting man is to encourage his fighting impulse when the enemy's in front of him and he wants to run away and flee. He needs to encourage that impulse. There are also occasions on which a mother's love for her own children or a man's love for his own country. I could have given funny illustrations of the first one, not related to myself, but people were having trouble having children. It's that time of the month. Okay, when it's right, I'm prime fertility right now. Okay, you know what's happening tonight. No! Yes, never mind. You wouldn't have thought. I shouldn't have said that, but too many thoughts. You have no idea. The duty in that, and it is a duty and a commitment in a relationship. All relationships have this possibility. You don't understand this. I say this to you because you're kids and you imagine that you're always ready. Right? Maybe I shouldn't have said that either. But there's when you're young, you want to throw some in and make this even a bonfire?
Well, no.
No, good.
Been married 27 years.
Okay.
So, would we not more accurately suggest that the encouragement of our sexuality is the fulfillment of the unity between the husband and the wife, and the child is a byproduct of that unity?
Yep.
Versus we're encouraging our sexuality to produce children.
It would be, and it's furthermore a commandment, be fruitful and multiply. It's the first commandment in Scripture, so it's obedience to that as well.
It's that your husband and your wife being one flesh.
Yep.
Then be fruitful and multiply.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. So these are illustrations of, again, instincts, but the instinct isn't sufficient to explain what we need to motivate that. There's something else there on us. And this is his way of illustrating a moral duty. And he says this is a point of great practical consequence. The most dangerous thing you can do is to take any one impulse of your own nature and set it up as the one thing you ought to follow at all costs. That is what we currently do through self-identification, by the way. There's this one thing about myself which I feel to be true, and I'm going to insist on it, that it defines me. It's an illustration of the same point. It may not even be true, by the way, but we feel it strongly. And say that I have to follow it at all costs, and also everyone else must acknowledge it as such. Or my nature is denied because my whole nature is connected with that one thing, which I believe strongly about myself. He says there's not one of them which will not make us into devils if we set it up as an absolute guide. You might think love of humanity in general was safe, but it is not. If you leave out justice, you will find yourself breaking agreements and faking evidence in trials, comma, or quotation, for the sake of humanity, and become in the end a cruel and treacherous man. So if you promote love at the expense of justice, you will become a wicked tyrant, a cruel and treacherous man, he says. Other people talk about it as a social convention, whatever. I'm going to skip over that, not because it's not worth, but because I will not get to the other chapters. That was the primary objection anyway. The other is that it's just a social convention. A lesser objection, I think. So the reality of the law, part 3. Let's go back to what I said at the end of the first chapter, that there were two odd things about the human race. First, that they're haunted by the idea of a sort of behavior they ought to practice, which you might call fair play or decency or morality or the law of nature. And second, that they did not in fact do so. Those are extraordinary things. And what's extraordinary about it is when we think of laws, we think of them in terms of natural laws which can't be broken. But here we have a genuine law, unlike those natural laws which are never broken, which we always break. Not every time, but consistently. There's always a little breach there, every day. We don't do something we ought to do. Now, some of you may wonder why I called this odd. It may seem to you the most natural thing in the world. In particular, you may have thought I was rather hard on the human race. After all, you may say that what I call breaking the law of right and wrong, or of nature, only means that people are not perfect. And why on earth should I expect them to be? That would be a good answer if what I was trying to do was to fix the exact amount of blame which is due to us for not behaving as we expect others to behave. But that's not my job at all. I'm not concerned at present with blame. I'm trying to find out truth. And from the point of view, that point of view, the very idea of something being imperfect, of its not being what it ought to be, has certain consequences. If you take a thing like a stone or a tree, it is what it is. And there seems no sense in saying it ought to have been otherwise. Of course, you may say a stone is the wrong shape if you want to use it for a rockery, that is a pile of rocks. Or that a tree is a bad tree because it does not give you as much shade as you would expect, like Jonah, when the leaves fall off the tree and he is angry. But all you mean is that the stone or the tree does not happen to be convenient for some purpose of your own. You're not, except as a joke, blaming them for that. It's a bad tree, bad stone. You really know that, given the weather and the soil, the tree could not have been any different. What we, from our point of view, call a bad tree is obeying the laws of its nature just as much as a good one. Have you noticed what follows? It follows that what we usually call the laws of nature are, the way the weather works, are not laws in the strict sense. Well, I've already talked about this, so I've anticipated this. So the laws of gravity, the laws of the way the animals work, the laws of the way trees operate, these are not laws properly. These are anthropomorphisms. Whereas what we talk about in relation to human nature is rather different. Now he says this is really peculiar because we're tempted to try and explain it away. For instance, we might try to make out that when you say a man ought not to act as he does, you only mean the same as when you say that a stone is the wrong shape, that he's doing something to be inconvenient to you. But that is simply untrue. A man occupying the corner seat in the train because he got there first, and a man who slipped into it while my back was turned and removed my bag are both equally inconvenient. But I blame the second man and do not blame the first. The man was already sitting there. Whereas my bag was in that seat and the other man took the bag away and sat in the seat. I'm angry at the man who took the bag away from the seat, even though both of them are sitting in the seat. It's equally inconvenient in both cases, but I'm only angry at one of them. I'm not angry except perhaps for a moment before I come to my senses with a man who trips me up by accident. I am angry with a man who trips me up, even if he does not succeed, even if it's not inconvenient. He tried to do that. Sometimes the behavior which I call bad is not inconvenient to me at all, but the very opposite. In war, each side may find a traitor on the other side very useful. It's very convenient. But though they use him and pay him, they regard him as human vermin. So you cannot say that what we call decent behavior in others is simply the behavior that happens to be useful to us. So this is the reality of the law. Men ought to be unselfish. They ought to be fair. Not that all men are unselfish, not that they like being unselfish, but they ought to be. The moral law or the law of human nature is not simply a fact about human nature, behavior in the same way the law of gravitation is, or may be, simply a fact about how heavy objects behave. On the other hand, it is not a mere fancy, for we cannot get rid of the idea, and most of the things we say and think about men would be reduced to nonsense if we did. Like, that guy's a jerk. What would that mean? And it's not simply there for our convenience. For the behavior we call bad or unfair is not exactly the same as the behavior we find inconvenient, and may be the opposite. Consequently, this rule of right and wrong, law of human nature, whatever you call it, must somehow or other be a real thing, a thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves. And yet, it is not a fact in the ordinary sense, in the same way our actual behavior is a fact. it begins to look as we shall have to admit that there is more than one kind of reality. Now this is interesting. Now he's building on everything he's established so far. There has to be more than one kind of reality. That is, in this particular case, there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior. And yet, quite definitely real. A real law, which none of us made, which we find pressing on us. He concludes the chapter there. The flattening of human nature, the reductionist, the developmentalism, where everything begins from the lower and moves up to the higher, the progressive view of human nature, that we have come from the mucky origins, just like the animals and the amoebas, and we've grown to develop reasoning. And it flattens everything at its basic root to that primal impulse. He's totally debunking it, saying, no, there's an aspect to our nature which is outside of that and above us, and let's acknowledge that. And he's done it by talking about the moral law. So it starts here, that something that everyone can see, which then points us to something that most people are going to deny even exists, or have tried to explain away, to developmentalism or instinct or social behavior, social construct. No. There is a law. What lies behind it? Well, that's chapter 4. Two fundamental views of the universe. One's religious, one's materialist. It's probably obvious from what I just said. The materialist is going to reduce everything to instincts, social conventions. The religious is going to say that, no, there is another reason for it. How do they differ? Note that he summarizes each time before he moves on. I want now to consider what this tells us about the universe we live in. Ever since men were able to think, they have been wondering what this universe really is and how it came to be there. And very roughly, two views have been held. First, there's the materialist view. People who take that view think that matter and space just happen to exist and always have existed. Nobody knows why. And that the matter, behaving in certain fixed ways, just happened by sort of a fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. By one chance in 1,000, something hit our sun and made it produce the planets. And by another 1,000th chance, the chemicals necessary for life and the right temperature occurred on one of these planets, and so, etc. This is called the anthropic principle. And he mentions a few factors here. There are about 13 or 14, and the possibilities of it are infinitesimal. It's not possible. In other words, it's totally impossible. What the materialist reduces to chance is more absurd than any postulate to the contrary. It's completely implausible. The other view is the religious view. According to it, what is behind this universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. That is to say, it is conscious, has purposes, prefers one thing to another. And on this view, it made the universe, partly for purposes we do not know, but partly, at any rate, in order to produce creatures like itself. I mean like itself to the extent of having minds. Note that this will be true of the biblical view of creation, and it will also be true of the account given by the Greek poets, the Babylonian creation myths, the Roman poet Ovid, where human beings have a rational nature just like the gods, etc. It's true in both cases. It's not just the biblical account. And on this view, it made the universe, partly for purposes we do not know, but partly, at any rate, in order to produce creatures like itself, to the extent of having minds. Now, please do not think that one of these views was held a long time ago and that the other has gradually taken its place. Wherever there have been thinking men, both views turn up. And note this, too. You cannot find out which view is the right one by science, in the ordinary sense. Science works by experiments. It watches how things behave. Every scientific statement in the long run, however complicated it looks, really means something like, I pointed the telescope to such and such a part of the sky at 2:20 a.m. on January 15th and saw so-and-so. Or, I put some of this stuff in a pot and heated it to such and such a temperature, and it did so-and-so. Do not think I am saying anything against science. I'm only saying what its job is. And the more scientific a man is, the more, I believe, he would agree with me that this is the job of science, and a very useful and necessary job it is too. But why anything comes to be there at all, and whether there is anything behind the things science observes, this is not a scientific question. Science is going to give you the answer because science doesn't even look at these things. So if we can't find the law of human nature from science, where are we going to find out which of these two options, the materialist or the religious, we choose? And then he points to desires within us. The question is this: we want to know whether the universe simply happens to be what it is for no reason, or whether there is a power behind it that makes it what it is. Since that power, if it exists, would not be one of the observed facts, but a reality which makes them, no mere observation of the facts can find it. There is only one case in which we can know whether there is anything more, namely our own case. Never mind hypothetical cases. We can't find it in any of those. We can find it only in our own case. And in that one case, we find there is. Or, put it the other way around, if there was a controlling power outside the universe, it could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe. So it has to be outside the universe. In other words, it has to be something akin to a director, a power, a guide. He says, I'm not saying, which you may think I'm saying because I'm a Christian, I'm referring to God here. I'm not even getting close to that. I'm just saying there has to be something like a mind outside the created universe which caused this to happen. And it will be like a mind, but it's not yet like a person. He's going to come to personhood, but he's not yet there. In the next chapter, he'll see if we can say anything more about it. I'll pick it up next time. Because chapter 5, I don't want to leave out. And he basically says we have cause to be uneasy on the basis of everything I've said thus far. We have good reason to be very uneasy about things. So you may have thought this was entertaining. You like the cut of my jib, the way I speak on the radio. I sound good. But you're feeling a little bit uncertain here, and you should.